We do begin with some breaking news. Germany's parliament has approved a landmark change to the constitution to loosen the so-called debt brake and allow unprecedented levels of government spending. The lawmakers passed legislation that will ease debt limits and allow the government to massively boost spending on defense, civilian infrastructure, and climate programs. Chancellor-in-waiting Friedrich Merz and his Conservatives, as well as their likely coalition partners, the Social Democrats, supported the measure. But Merz had to rely on support from the Green Party to secure a two-thirds majority needed to change the constitution. So let's get into this. In the studio with me here is our political correspondent, Matthew Moore. And at the Bundestag, we have our chief political editor, Michaela Küfner. Michaela, this vote obviously marks a huge change in Germany's budgetary policy. Put it in concrete terms for us. Exactly what is this going to mean for the future of the country?
Well, first of all, it means this is the one bridge that Friedrich Merz needed to cross to actually become chancellor, to form a new coalition government. He's vowed to do this by Easter, and now he has the money to back up his words. And of words and promises, there were many. He said that Germany was back, Germany would take a leading role, and that it would do whatever it takes. Yes, that's the Mario Draghi quote. To bolster German and European defense. Now he has financial means to do this beyond 1% spending. Germany can now take on a sheer unlimited amount of debt in a departure from its debt brake in the constitution. So if the political will is there, he will always be able to act. And secondly, Germany is spending some 500 billion euros in debt that it can now take on for infrastructure. 100 billion of that will go into climate. So this is what Friedrich Merz desperately needed. And the climate bit is what the Greens really wanted. They played hardball in the end and actually, interestingly, put a green stamp on what will be a very conservative CDU-led government.
And just give us a little bit of context here for those who haven't been following the ins and outs of all of this. How were they justifying the need to pass these measures?
Well, there's no glossing over that. This was a 100-degree turnaround from what Friedrich Merz promised during the election campaign. He got elected, his party won these elections on the promise of not touching the German debt brake. Then he argued that the world had changed, pointing towards Donald Trump, that scene in the Oval Office where Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, was essentially ridiculed and belittled and calling into question transatlantic relations, but also the whole concept of US-backed European defense as a whole. The Greens called his bluff there to a certain degree, arguing that they felt that this was a playbook, that this was something he planned to do all along. Interestingly, the polls doesn't show any change. People don't seem to care that terribly much that Friedrich Merz completely changed his tune there. And he argues it's a historic necessity. So do the Social Democrats of the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who are still running the government and who are saying, Boris Pistorius, the defense minister here in Parliament, said that this is a second Zeitenwende. It's a real turning point in European history. And the reason given was that Germany simply needs to be equipped militarily, and in order to do that, financially, of course.
And Matthew, this was not without its critics, right? We had even members of Merz's own party accusing the man who will almost certainly become the next chancellor of Germany of voter fraud in trying to push this through, right? Can you explain what the dynamics were?
Yeah, Michaela touched on it there. It was this 180-degree turn from Friedrich Merz. In the campaign, the election campaign that we had in recent weeks, the emphasis was on fiscal prudence, on cutting money from the budget to finance more spending on the defence budget. And what we've seen just within weeks is really a massive change. And we heard yesterday, his general secretary of the CDU basically saying, for me, he said, I have a bad feeling in my stomach when I see us breaking promises like this so quickly after the election. It's also been something that the far right have accused him of, something that even the people, the Free Democrats have all been saying, look, what happened to the Friedrich Merz that we saw in the campaign? The other big controversial aspect of this massive package that we're talking about here is that it's been done with the majority of the old Bundestag because it needed that two-thirds, and we just heard that it passed with that two-thirds majority, and it wouldn't have passed in the new Bundestag, which will be sworn in on Tuesday, a week from now. So there was a huge amount of pressure on them to get this done fast. That led to criticism from parties on the left and on the right who went to the Constitutional Court and said this is illegitimate, it's anti-democratic.
So not the government that has just been elected in February's recent elections here, right?
Well, they needed the votes of the Greens. So there are people who voted on this who will not be in the next Parliament. Some of them said, look, I'm really glad that this is my last act because we've rested on our laurels for too long in this country. And people need to see that we're taking their concerns seriously, not just on defence, but also on infrastructure. Huge sums of money being talked about here that will go into infrastructure.
Will make a huge difference in Germany's future. I'm curious, though, whether, Matthew, whether this move by Friedrich Merz, whether, because of the dynamics you've just talked about there, this could actually frustrate people who see it as their voice not being heard and perhaps even play to the strengths of some of the more extremist, smaller parties.
Well, that's the criticism that we've heard in the Parliament today. People saying that you are you're contributing to a loss of trust in politics when you say one thing to the voters in January, February, and then you say something completely different in March. But the question and the fact of the matter is that in the public polling, two-thirds of people want more spending on defence, they want more spending on infrastructure, and they're happy for the German government to borrow to do that. So Friedrich Merz is counting on him having the broader public mood behind him for his policies. And he's also probably counting on the fact that he will not be going to the polls again for another 4 years. So he's hoping that potentially over time they will see the benefits of this huge spending and that it will help to turn around not just the German defence forces, but also the German economy as a whole.
Well, thank you so much. We have been speaking to DW's political correspondent Matthew Moore in the studio and DW's chief political editor Michaela Küfner at the German Bundestag.